Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us tonight. My name's Krista. I'm with Faber-Castell this evening, and Franz Spohn is here. He will be doing the workshop with you tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to post those in the chat, and I will do my best to answer all of your questions there in the chat. And if there's something that I don't quite know the answer to, I will break in and ask Franz to address that directly for you. So sit back, enjoy, have a great workshop. Thank you again for being here with us.
Well, hello, everybody. I hope you're all set to have fun. We're going to be doing soft pastels, but instead of using white paper, we're going to enter the dark side and work on black paper. So I thought I would start first by, showing an example of some of the pastel work that I have been doing. This is a friend of mine. It's a tin toy. He's kind of rusted, beat up. But I found that he was really fascinating to me to use as a prop for my, and I don't know. I just don't know why I had such an affinity for this object. I have no idea. So anyhow, so that was something I've already done on white paper. And I started thinking, well, what could we do tonight that we could do on black paper? And again, I get these curious little things. I found this poor guy. He's an Easter rabbit. And I imagine that a year ago, he looked pretty good. But after everything, the reason I thought about doing him was I thought it'd be really a lot of fun to do striped pants. But I thought, no, this is too painful reminder of the last year. So instead, we're going to do a happy ceramic Porky Pig bank. All right. And so this is kind of like an older version. I'll get him out of the light there. There we go. So I thought this is a happier thing to draw. So we'll go with this one. And we've downloaded an image of him in the chat room. So if you'd like to kind of use download it or look at it or whatever, have a reference to it, that'll be available. And if you don't, then find something that you have nearby. It could be a piece of fruit. It could be anything you want, because I like you to at least just kind of try and see if you can play around with some of the techniques that I'd like to show you. So we'll put him back up here. Okay, and now we'll switch over to my other camera. Okay, and there we go. So I'm going to be doing a couple of switches with the camera back and forth, mainly because I want to make sure that you can see what I'm doing. But I thought that we just do a real simple kind of little explanation about what we're going to be doing here. So this is a piece of white paper. What I'm doing tonight, I'm using for the black paper, I'm using Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press Black, and that's made by the Legion Paper Company. This is a really nice heavy paper. It's 300 grams per square meter, 10 by 14. They come in big sheets, but it's a really nice paper. It has a good amount of sizing, so it allows you to do erasers and really work on it. And then for the white paper, which we'll only be kind of doing for the one little demo, this is their Aqua Cold Press. So these are actually watercolor papers, but it has a nice texture that works really well for pastels. So I thought we'd go with those papers. Now, usually, like with the white paper, everybody's kind of accustomed to that. So if I want to kind of draw a sphere, I can do a little outline, then I can just start building it up. And what we do is we have a tendency to build up the darker areas. Okay, and then the intermediate tones, and then the paper is the highlight. So we start with a white piece of paper, and the more pigment we add, the darker it gets. And so if we want to do this monochromatically, then you'd have a shadow that would be very dark. If the light's coming from this direction, then you'd have a shadow down here. And then usually have a little bit of kind of a bounce from the surface light reflection kind of underneath it. So get something that's going to look a bit like that. On black paper, it's a bit different. So that I could do the same thing, but if this is going to be my highlight area in through here, I'm going to put more and more and more and more pigment there so that it, and then on the part here where I have the shadow, where I kind of really build it up with more pigment, I'm going to put just a tiny little bit there. And so if I work that in and the texture takes over a little bit. Now, obviously, to get a bright white highlight, I'm going to have to use like a white pastel. If I want to make that a little bit lighter too, I could do the same thing. But the idea is I'm going from the white of the paper for the highlight and add pigment to get the dark. And in this, in order to get the brighter areas, I have to add a lot of pigment. And then in the area that I want to be in shadow, then I hardly have any at all. Now, what I like about this, okay, then let's put a shadow in there as well. So, you know, black and black is not going to show up. But if we were going to have, let's say, a blue background, I'm going to make that a little bit brighter in here, and then get a little bit darker as it comes around. But then the black of the paper itself, becomes a shadow. So we'll put a blue background on this as well. And then we'll put a more kind of traditional darker shadow. I'll use a little dark blue. Okay. Now, I think what is interesting to me is that the black one is more dramatic to me. And I think part of it is you have so much white, and the white is so intense, it reflects a lot of light back. And so it just makes the white the predominant thing. And with starting with the black paper and adding pigment to it, then it's absorbing light. So instead of bouncing off, it's absorbing, and it just visually you just react to that differently. So I think that this is much more dramatic, and it makes the color glow up against that black, even though you have most of it covered, because these pastels are, if you put them on nice and thick, they're very opaque, but the bits that still have the black coming through. So you get your tonality going from, let's do this again in the background here. So if I just barely put anything down, you know, that's on the very low end of the value range. But as I start to build it up, then it goes from dark to light. And what I especially like is the way that this kind of taper, it just disappears to the background. And I think visually, what I would kind of compare it to is like if you go to see a play, let's say a Shakespeare play, and somebody has a soliloquy, they don't have all the stage lights on at one time, they have a spotlight. And so then the background becomes kind of disappears and becomes dark and very mysterious. And as you have these things emerging out of the background, then I think it's much more dramatic than something that is on all this white. So that, I think, is what attracts me to it, even though a lot of the things that I do are, you know, totally covered anyhow. But that's kind of the theory that I want to work on. Okay, so I have one other thing to kind of maybe illustrate, you know, another real fast exercise. And again, this is on the black paper. And I'll just tape it up. And then also you'll see that, on these two, since it was just like a real quick little exercise. All right, I want to make sure I get this. There it is. You can see that I add some painter's tape. And the reason I use this, it's kind of a low tack. So I pull it off, then it doesn't harm the paper. Okay. And so very quickly, I'm going to move the camera over. We'll move him for a second, because I will bring him in later. But let's see if we get a little bit closer here. Well, anyhow, this is going to be what I'm going to draw. It's like it's for hair, I guess. It's a flexible curler with a rod in it or something like that. So I just made a real simple shape. And I'm going to put it there, and then I'm going to start working on the drawing. So let me move the camera over. All right, we'll just kind of keep it over there. And I'm going to make it a little bit brighter perhaps than that one. I'm going to make it more like kind of a turquoise. So I'm going to start off, look at the shapes. And so this is pretty much kind of a full coloration of it. And then this is where it has kind of a highlighted area, and it's a little bit brighter. So I'm going to start kind of moving that around. And as it comes down to the bottom, it gets a little darker. So I don't know if, I guess that's showing up well enough. But let me get a little more light on that. See if that'll help. There. Okay, so now I've got that in through there, and then it gets a little bit darker. So I'm thinking that, the light is coming from up above and down there a bit. So I can come over here and start getting this. And I have a tendency to want to develop the overall kind of a basic color in the beginning. So I don't want to get too fussy with things, but I just want to get the main shapes in. All right, so I've got kind of a highlighted area there. And then I'm just dragging from light into dark. Now, you can use your finger. You can also use these paper stomps. I find these pick up a little bit more of the soft pastel, but you can kind of use them to help blend. And then the other thing too is, like, if you discover that maybe you've been a little bit too exuberant with your application, you can take an eraser, and then it's just like the black is back because there's a shadow that's there that I kind of covered up. So already it's starting to kind of emerge. All right, now up here, this definitely is a lot bluer at the top. And the other thing I do too, this is an Albrecht Dürer white watercolor pencil. And I find that because this is a little bit powdery, if you put on really lightly, then it's a good thing to kind of sketch your initial shapes in. And so let's, all right, so this is the, and then again, it kind of starts coming down into here. And I'm putting a little heavier application there so that I can kind of draw it down and start working it into the sides that are going to be a little bit darker. So again, instead of adding pigment to make the shadows, I'm working on the lighter areas with the greatest concentration of the pigment and then dragging it down. Okay. Just a little bit. Now you can also, in addition to using your finger, you can use an old rag or a new rag, so they don't have to be old. And sometimes it may be a little more efficient to do it this way. So now I'm kind of think about where the brightest areas are, and now I'm thinking about the midtones. I want to kind of get that nice. Okay, so right here, where this thing comes down in through here, I can see that it is a lot brighter because it's flat as it goes in. And then it gets darker again. Okay. Then I've got this coming forward. I try not to be too fussy. I do the blending just to get the midtones in there, and then I like to put very bold applications of the pigment, you know, like that again. Okay, so it's starting to take form. All right, this one just stays kind of dark. So I'm hardly putting any on that. And then what'll really make this pop. Okay, so up here, it's very bright again. There. That. Okay, this has like a white end to it, piece of plastic that you can see there. It's brighter on this side. And you might also have like some whites handy. So if I'm using either the paper stomp or my finger to, I'm sure you're familiar with this routine. Using wipes to clean your fingers. So you can see how, like, I started with white, and if I rub it into the paper, all of a sudden, oh, it's gone from white to gray. And then I can come back in and reapply a brighter white for kind of a highlight. Move that around a little bit. Okay, so we got that. Just a tiny bit up here. Then kind of been through here. As we start kind of working with, all right, now as it comes around here, a little bit wider there if I'm going from that kind of nice blue to the dark. Here's a little more. Okay, so that's starting to be the actual curler shape. And now I kind of anticipate the real fun here. Put in the background. So I've indicated where the shadows are. So everything else is going to be fairly bright. So this is where it really is going to start taking form, because it's going to help define some of the edges. And then this is where one of the shadows is. I'm going to kind of start letting it fade out a little bit. But the really rich dark shadows, I want to be the black of the paper. Okay, so then I'm taking one of my stomps here. And I got that. As it goes, there's a little bit of light that leaks around it, so that isn't totally black. It's very dark. What I like to do is just kind of scrub it out, and then you can kind of see the way it goes from a real dark, rich shadow into kind of a lighter shadow. It isn't totally black. And I'll do the same thing here. But I think what I want to do is make this this a little bit lighter. So I want to kind of make a distinction between the horizontal plane and the vertical plane, but there's a little bit of shadow there. Send that like that. Block it there, but I'll take care of that. Right. Okay, now in through here. The shadow is just kind of in through here, but this is mainly like how it goes in there a little bit and then kind of balloons out a little bit down. So again, this is a really good way for me to be able to help get the blue curler to pop from the background. Okay, so now as I come up, my light starts to fade off a little bit. Again, this is kind of like that emerging out of the darkness that I like so much. And if you want to, you can leave the texture in there. You don't have to, totally smooth everything off. You might kind of enjoy the look of the texture. May prove the point a little bit more if we. You see how atmospheric that becomes. Okay, and I'll come back. And then reinforce it again with that. And then I still get some texture this way, but then it's a little murkier. Okay, so one area here that got a little out of the way. Now, if I want to soften the background shadow, so that becomes a little bit more dramatic, I might just kind of pick some of this yellow up and then just start. Actually, just very lightly go over that. Okay, so anyhow, this is just like a really fast kind of exercise to give you, the general gist of how this works. Some of that yellow came down, so I might want to reinforce the blue. Oops. Gonna clean my finger off. Yeah. Okay, I'll just say it's done. Okay, so, you know, it should give you an idea of how you can get these objects to pop and emerge out of the background. And then one of my favorite things to do, then is once I'm finished, then you can peel the tape off, and then wherever you have kind of a nice buildup of, I just love seeing that crisp edge. It kind of sets off any of the more kind of painterly things. And that's another thing too, is a lot of times, you know, if you're looking for demos, or if you're looking at somebody who does the pastels, they talk about pastel paintings. So, you know, you can think about applying, you know, instead of it being a drawing as such, it's more like you're painting, you're putting the color on in a painterly way. So, yeah, you could go back in and touch it up and everything. But as I said, this is just kind of like a demo, just to give you the general idea of how it works. Okay, so now let's go back to our friend Porky. And I seem to have, oh, here's the green paper. So I'm going to go again. And I'll just kind of position him. I'm going to try to get him about the same place that I had him before. And I had a spotlight on him, but it threw the exposure off so that everything else disappeared. So I'm going to use the same download. Now, I hope everybody had a chance to download the image. If you want to work along, it should be in the chat room. But let's get the key drawing here. So, and I'm going to move the camera a little bit so that you get, okay. So we'll kind of work on the face, and if need to, I can back it off and whatnot. So again, what I'm working on, working with Faber-Castell's soft pastel, Faber-Castell soft pastels, and this is the set of 24 half sticks. Now I'll hold them up so you see what you're going to get. I've been putting them through their paces, so I have 2/3 sticks or whatever. And then they also have a set of 36. So to go from 12 to 36 colors is quite exciting for me. So that's what the 36 set looks like. And then these are full sticks. So there are a lot of pastel drawings that are available with this set. Okay, so I'm going to set them down. And again, the idea is I want to develop, I want to leave the shadows. I want to be somewhat conservative about this because I want to make sure that I don't cover up so much that I don't have that kind of nice atmospheric thing from the shadows. Okay, so let's start up here. Let me just look. Yep, I think you can see it. So on this side, the light's kind of coming from this side. So all this stuff is going to be much brighter. And then this side of his face is in more of a shadow. All right, so I'm going to, again, kind of start off blocking it in. I got about half an hour left, so I'll see how much we can get done. And the other thing I find too is that if that's a rounded head, I don't want to go back and forth, but I want to kind of use the side of the pastel. That's the other thing too, is that, when I was in elementary school, you always get, your box of crayons, and I always hated to use them because they look so nice just as crayons as an object. But eventually you found out, well, you got to take the wrapper off sometimes, and sometimes a smaller piece. So if your pastels break, that actually is going to help you, because in some cases, especially if you're going into small little areas, a smaller pastel works better than using the whole block. But you can see that, what I'm doing now is applying just the general tones very lightly with the side. So with these pastels, let me get another piece of paper here. I can get a mark using the side of them. And obviously, depending on how wide the stick is, it'll give me that mark. So I could build up areas very quickly. I can tilt it and use an edge, and then I could get marks like that. And then I can rotate it so that I'm on the corner and I can get lines. So depending on how you hold it and how you apply the pastel, you can get large areas, you can get smaller areas, and get details. Okay, so the side of Porky here is like he's got this enormous forehead. That's actually kind of one of the reasons I want to do him. I just sculpturally, I like the way he looks. And then so I'm just kind of laying out the general areas. And wherever there's kind of a shadow, I'm going to back off from that a little bit, because again, I don't want to light that too much. I like the idea of it being very dark and everything's emerging. Okay, so now let's kind of start looking in the eyeball. So if I analyze the shape, it gets a little bit darker as it comes in through here, but then, the eyeball around the edge is recessed. It goes in and then it kind of scallops out a little bit. And so as I look at it, I can kind of see a highlighted edge. So if this is at the bottom and this is where it starts coming up to the top, then it goes thick and then it goes down to being thin again. Okay, so you can see the way that the thing's starting to emerge. And then up here, there's a little bit of an edge at the top. And it's a little bit brighter. And then it gets a little gray. All right, so we'll kind of start with that. And again, don't forget to clean your fingers if that's what you're using to blend with. You can also use Q-tips. I have a tendency to use Q-tips for areas that are a little more delicate. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking that really nice thick application of the pastel material and I'm spreading it a little bit thinner, so the black paper underneath it is having more of an influence. But that's kind of what I was going after, because now I can come back with my white and then put a layer on top of that. And I've got that recess that's catching the highlight again. So the light's coming in from this way. Okay, so let's go back up into here. This part of the eyeball, again, because it's popping out. A little bit higher. So it's going to be a little bit brighter. And then I want to kind of take some of that and I want to start getting a little bit of a shadow. So it goes from bright highlight and then all of a sudden it stops because you can't see underneath there anymore. And so then you get the shadow here and then the top of that. So a lot of it is just about analyzing your shapes And of course, this is, I'm doing this, so it's like kind of a recognizable object, which is something I love doing. But, you could be playing around with something, you could use these as an abstract material too. If you're into abstraction and all that, then it's just a matter of using the same principles, but maybe to make more formal space rather than realistic space. I got to try to kind of keep that texture in there because it's going to make that eye stand out a little bit. All right, so let's get up to the ear here. And right here, there's a highlight. And then, as one would expect, you also get a bit of a bright. And I want to get, make sure that it stops there because that's where this kind of swells up. All right. And then, as I mentioned, this is still in here, but it gets very dark as it comes around. I'm not going to rub it too hard because I don't want it to gray out too much, but you can see the way that we're developing this a little bit at a time. Now, a lot of times, I gotta reach around and see if I can find my brush. I have a real soft brush. It just really feels good. All right, but when I get stuff like this, instead of blowing it, a lot of times just hardly any pressure and I get rid of all that dust. And I want to make sure that I don't drag my hand through it. You could erase it, but sometimes, you just keep on doing it and it doesn't quite come out. Okay, so let's get, what color shall we choose next? All right, let's go. It's kind of a reddish color in his ears. All right, so up and through here, it's going to be a little bit brighter. Up against that edge. And then it actually gets quite more like kind of a pink as it comes in through here, maybe a little bit of orange, but we'll add that. And it kind of goes with this bright highlight. But then when it comes in through here, especially this part, that's more in shadow. So there's like, this will give the impression that the inside is concave. And then I want this part to look darker. But then right in through here is where it's a lot brighter. So you're playing, the value off against, so this is kind of light, this is a little bit darker. As you come in through here, this gets a little brighter into there. Okay, so we'll fuss with that later, but just that'll kind of get it set. So that really kind of gives you the idea that this stays nice and dark down here. All right, now there's a little bit of paint missing, and this is the part that I also like kind of playing with. There's a little bit of paint missing. So I'm going to lighten it up a little bit in through there, and a couple little flecks here. Now this is something that I usually do kind of after I get most everything else done, but seeing how when I can get the whole thing done on the workshop, I want to give you a couple of things to think about there. Okay, so he's really starting to pop out there. Now his eye, there's kind of like a painted highlight on his eye that is right about here. I'll put that in there, and that's really bright white. And then there's a patch of blue, and it's like a light blue and then a darker blue. So I'm going to put the light blue in first. And that's kind of up and through here. And then a little bit through there. And then it kind of slops over. It's like, these are hand painted. So some of it slops over onto the part that's not the painted pupil, and it's raised up a little bit. Okay, so let's see here. It's a little bit too dark. So I want to kind of come around, make sure that you can kind of tell that he actually has. But I want to keep it pretty dark. And maybe on something like that, again, this is a good time to get the Q-tip out. I want to get enough value in there so you can see where that pupil is. Okay, I think he's starting to look like what we want. Now, the other thing too, sometimes I find that especially with the lighter colors, with the white, it gets covered with red or whatever. So I want to make sure it's white the next time I apply it. So just, get your rag or a piece of paper towel or something and clean that up. And then your material will be pure again. Okay, so now up and through here, this is fairly bright. I'll make that a little bit thicker there. That's absolutely white. Okay, so, but there's a pretty pronounced shadow up and through here. So I'm going to kind of continue. Put it down and bring it across. And now this part of his forehead is not only going down this way, but it also is curving around here. And so when we come down to his nose, go up a little bit more. So now I'm going to keep this very light in through here because this is going to be a bit of a shadow, but his cheek comes around here. Okay, this is kind of a flat part here that comes to meet the cheek, and then the cheek sticks out a little bit. And then down here, this flattens out again. It's kind of dark. So we'll add that like that. Okay. A little red on his forehead, that's all right. Now this figure used to be painted kind of Porky Pig pink or pinkish orange, and most of the paint has come off of it. So on this side, it's a little bit more prevalent in terms of that kind of porky color. Okay, that's still a little bit too dark, but I want to kind of build it up cautiously. So in through here, this is again the brightest part. Then I can start going up a little more tone as we come around this way. Now, if I have a kind of brighter in through here, then this becomes very kind of mysterious up and through there. Okay, so let's work on the cheek some more. And then let's get the nose going. Okay, the front of the nose. It's very flat, more or less. He's got his little nostrils there. Again, I'm going to be very conservative about applying this to begin with. All right, now right on the side of his nostril, there's a bit of a highlight. And I want to remind myself that I want to keep that nice and bright. And then it's recessed. And then over here, it's the same thing, kind of consistent with both of them. But the side is much brighter because it's coming perpendicular out of the head. So by making that really bright, you can kind of see the way that really pops out. So yeah, he's come along here. He's come along here. Okay, so obviously this has to be a lot brighter, but I'm going to kind of keep it. I'm going to let it taper off a little bit as it comes down there. And again, probably a good time to get the brush out. Okay. So before we go too much farther, why don't we kind of concentrate on what's happening on the right-hand side? Because that's where the shadows are, and that's where it gets kind of fun. So when I look at it, the real one, there's just like this slight kind of grayed out pinkish tone. So I want to very lightly start, again, I think I'm going to purposely break this. I was always so mad when that happened to me when I was in first grade. Now it is the solution. Okay, so now what I want to do is start very lightly. Again, just kind of follow the curve of the head. I want to try to keep from drawing any kind of a line. And so there's this kind of little blending area in through here, and then it gets really dark. So I'm going to take my cloth and do a little bit of, I just want a hint of color in here. Okay, so it's a little bit brighter up at the top, still darker, and there's still kind of a, that's kind of like that. And then it starts to disappear. So you might end up building it up and building it up and tearing it down and then building it up. It's just, a little bit of kind of patience with what you're doing. But what I'm trying to do is kind of fill the valleys of that paper, take advantage of the texture a little bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now the front of his nose, his snout there, isn't quite bright white consistently. I want to kind of keep his highlights. Okay, step back every once in a while, have a look, see what's going on. Okay, so now I want to start kind of building on the bridge of his nose. This kind of comes up and then tapers off a little bit, and then it kind of a complex thing here. It comes around this way and then up. All right. Now, over here, I definitely want to make sure we get this in so you can see the effect. Now, even though I haven't done very much on this side of the face, having a highlight like this really pops. It's like the one thing, that's the part of his, with the light coming through here, that's like the one place that light is able to catch a surface over on this side of his cheek. And it may look a little bit startling right there because it's so isolated, but if you really kind of look at it, it's like, oh yeah. And then if we come back up here and then do an equally, I mean, to me, that is just so dramatic, and it's just so much fun to see that. And everything else could be kind of dark. And so your eye starts kind of putting these things together, like this really bright highlight over here and this down there. And it really gives you a sense of kind of the light and what's happening. And at some point, if you have things in the background you don't want, just take your eraser. You don't have to use a lot of pressure on this, but all right. So now looking at the eyeball on the other side, what I'm going to do is just put a very, very light bit of color in here. Value, and come around like that. So instead of being a really bright white eyeball, it's going to be just a gray. All right. And that's pretty much it for the eyeball, except for you can see just a little bit of the blue again. And so I'm going to put application of blue in through here. And I'm going to take my paper stomp or a Q-tip. And as I blend that, more and more of the influence of the black comes through. So try to make it look like, okay, this blue is the same as that blue, except for that blue is in bright light and this is in a shadow. And then use my eraser again. Got a little bit too much tone on the black. I want the black to really kind of come through a little stronger there. Okay. All right, so you get this raking light that's coming across, and it's just whatever's kind of poking out, and then as it goes around, it kind of disappears. So I still want to get just a little bit of tone in a couple of these areas, because right in through here is where it's the darkest. So if I put some tone in there and I decide, well, that's not quite dark enough, I can always go ahead. Now, the other thing that you can use too is a kneaded eraser. Now, kneaded erasers are a little bit sticky. And so if I want to pick that up, I don't have to rub. I can just press down on it, press down on it, press down on it. And I can pick it up. And it could be, a lot subtler. All right, let's look at that cheek. That's another area that there's just a little bit of color. So what I want to do is kind of come across here like that. Just a blush of color. But I want to keep this shadow area a little deeper, because then that's really going to make it pop out. And then I think I might have had a little too much on that, so I want to pick. I still want that highlight to be very dramatic. So in through here, I'm going to erase just a little bit and then let it kind of stay over here. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the snout a little bit. So it's a little brighter up here too. Now with the mouth, this part lost some of its paint. We'll get that same kind of reddish color out. just a little bit paint kind of rubbed off. A little brighter there, and that it goes into darker into that. All right, so this is part of the lip. When it comes, it's curving out from the surface. So it really, and then it kind of tapers off into almost nothing. And then underneath that, there's kind of like this little it's popping out. Now, just because we're getting close to time, what I want to do is this part of his collar comes out, and as it curves around here, it's really sticking out enough to catch some light. So again, that's going to kind of work with all this stuff. And then maybe very quickly, what I can do is start filling in some of the background so you can see what the effect is going to be similar to the knot. So all right, so oops, made a mistake. Sorry about that. Went right into my shadow. Got a shadow that comes across here, but that's and if you set up your still lifes or your objects or whatever it is that you're drawing, or if you're doing a portrait, shadows are really good for making things. You know, this shadow coming in through here and down there will help give that a presence. So what I'm going to do is shadow kind of comes like that. So now I'm kind of rubbing it in. I'm trying to get the grain to be really saturated, and I'm going to build this up and build it up a bit. But then when it starts coming up here, I'm going to let it fade out just a bit. You know, what's up here. Back and maybe make it a little bit brighter into here. And this is a good way to really crisp that edge up. And then I'm going to start to a little bit lighter. And then once I get down here, I want it to be nice and saturated. And just let it kind of fade out into the corners. Okay, so I think you get the idea. Okay, well, so you can kind of see the way this is going to develop. What I want to do is there's a little bit of color up on its cheek here. So I want to start working on this to make that kind of nice and rounded. But I want to keep that real dark area in there where the shadow is. It kind of comes in here like that. And then the shadow starts about there. little bit of right up there, over there, and then kind of a darker color, not quite black, but there's a little nose. And so let me, this is kind of a final thing. I want to maybe put some really bright white areas. Because once you get most of your value done, to kind of put some really bright highlights in is going to be the thing that will make this really work nicely. Yep. Okay, then this could use a little brightening here. Okay. All right. So I think that, yeah, we didn't get the whole thing finished, but I would just continue to do the same thing as they come down to the rest of the body, you know, kind of get that to be nice and rounded. He's got like a red jacket on, but I want to keep all this really dark, you know, and so the only place that I really have some bright areas, but everything else is going to be more like that tone. With the exception like his bow, as it pops out, that's another one of those things that is going to be really bright in through here. But then there's a shadow that kind of comes down. All right, so this is full thing, but then there's a shadow that comes across here. And then you have a couple other areas that are really kind of bright, like a highlight. That's part of that bow. But then as it comes around this way, it just kind of disappears a little bit. And then you might have just a hint of red in through here, but just, oh, it's the light. You want it to keep on migrating into black areas, and that makes it look much more interesting. Okay, so that's what I've got for you tonight. If we can switch to the front on camera real quick. Let me turn the lights down so you can kind of see how our guy is emerging from a farther point of view. And yeah, I find it tremendous fun. And I'd keep on building the background up so it's kind of bright, but I really like the way it's almost like this kind of glowing color in through there. And then you can imagine what it's going to look like with it being a little darker and then bright again here. And then you've got the bottom shadow that's coming across here. You know, so it creates a really nice atmosphere, I think. And as I said, you know, like the soliloquy in a Shakespeare play, you know, it's very dramatic. So this is more in terms of a visual thing. So I hope that you learned some tricks about working on black paper. Give it a try, because it really is, it's so unusual. We're so used to working on white paper, and the whole idea that you could work on a dark paper is kind of astounding, but you can see that you can really start getting things to pop out. You can create your own little atmospheric world. So thank you all for coming. It was a lot of fun showing you how to work with this, and I hope it inspires you to do your own masterpieces. So everybody have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Franz, for being here tonight.
You bet.